Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the April 13 work session of the Ann Arbor City Council, in which we discuss A20 carbon neutrality plan led by the indomitable Dr. Stoltz. Dr. Stoltz, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mayor, members of Council. It's our pleasure to be here with you again for take 2 of our work session on carbon neutrality and the A20 plan. Before I jump in, I do want to give my team a heads up. I'd like them just to say hi, and some of them are having some problems today with Wi-Fi, so they're going to come on video on and off throughout, but I just want you to know they're here, and we'll start with Thea. Can you come off mute and tell everyone who you are?
Hi everyone, my name's Thea. I'm an energy fellow in the office. I've worked there for about a year.
Thank you, Thea. Galen?
Good evening, everybody. I'm Galen Hardy. I'm the Community Engagement Specialist.
Thank you, Galen. Josh?
Josh McDonald, Energy Coordinator for the Office of Sustainability and Innovations.
And Zach?
Hi, everyone. I'm Zach. I am also a Community Engagement Specialist.
Great. Excellent. Well, thank you all for joining us, and thanks to Council for the opportunity to talk about the plan in depth. I am going to share my screen here, and I just want to confirm, for those I can see a nod of heads? Can you see my screen? All right. Excellent. So what I hope to be able to do for our time together is just a few remarks, hopefully no more than 30 minutes at most, touching on the high level points of our carbon neutrality strategy. And then I want to open it up, obviously, for a question and answer. I realize this is an overarching plan. It is a wide-reaching plan. And so there are a lot of questions that we have. I am going to assume that most people watched the initial video, so I'm not going to go into a lot of depth about things that are repeated in that video. Again, I'm just going to touch on the highlights. So with that being said, I do feel like I need to sincerely thank the many, many people who made this plan possible. The plan, you'll hear it over and over again, is a living plan. It is iterative. We are going to edit it and change it. Technology will change. Our landscape will change. But a lot of people came together to put together the plan that you see before you. So I very much want to thank the staff who spent more hours than I can calculate working on this. They gave up nights, they gave up weekends, and really put their all into this plan. A lot of different areas within the city. In fact, actually every service area within the city contributed to the plan, but there were certain units that stepped up more, and I want to call them out. We had over 80 technical advisors. We had over 60 partner organizations. We worked, I think our calculation is close to about 15,000 members of the public in some way, shape, or form engaged in at least one A20 initiative or touched on the work in some way, shape, or form. And we pulled pretty heavily from peer communities, both domestic and international. And I want to acknowledge them. And I would be 100% remiss if I also didn't acknowledge all of you for the leadership that you have demonstrated and the platform that you've given us to really deeply explore what it would take to achieve carbon neutrality. This, it is the resolution that you passed on November 4th, where you declared a climate emergency and you directed the city to begin purposefully and in earnest looking at what it would take to achieve carbon neutrality community-wide by the year 2030. And so that was the charge that we took, and we took that very sincerely. We sometimes joke in the office that we took about 2 or 3 days to kind of let it sink in, cry a little bit, and then just start sprinting, getting to work. And that's what we did. And so A20 is how we talk about it. It's how we talk about the planning process. It's how we talk about the plan itself. And it's how we're branding the initiatives that come out of the process, just to make it a lot easier for people to understand how all of these things fit together. Because as you know, there is a lot that falls under this rubric. So the charge for carbon neutrality, again, just as a reminder, we do greenhouse gas emissions inventories. Our inventory baseline of 2018 is what we're working from, and that's where we've got a baseline of 2.1 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Over time, we have, as a community, been doing a laudable job in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. From our baseline of 2000, we've achieved about a 14% community-wide reduction, and of course, the goal is 0. And to get there means that that downward trend chart has to rapidly drop. So our emissions inventory in 2018, we are working on finishing 2019, and we are moving towards an annual inventory to track, but this gives us a sense of where our emissions fall by both sector and source. And this was very informative for us as we were doing our analysis, because it let us know where to target. So knowing that 52% of our emissions come from electricity tells us a significant amount of our solutions have to focus on electricity. Similarly, natural gas being 28%, let us focus on how we were going to green that particular sector. And then understanding the sources of those emissions, so what percent came from residential, commercial, helped us kind of round out the strategies in terms of collaboration, the kinds of activities we're proposing to undertake. They look different if you're talking about a rental unit, a single family home, a private sector enterprise, or you're talking about an academic institution. So this is just a reminder, the way that we do inventories is standardized. So the way that Ann Arbor does an inventory is the exact way that New York City or Copenhagen or London or Brisbane is doing their inventory. And that's to make sure that we count things in the same way and that we don't double count things within our system. So we follow what's called scopes. And again, happy to answer any questions there. I do want to reiterate what's not included in the inventory, because this is important. All of us are sitting in buildings right now, and I'm surrounded by wood. There's probably some steel in this home that I'm in, and there are embedded emissions that are in this building. Those aren't calculated in our inventory, nor are the upstream emissions associated with the production of things like this water bottle. There's a lot of energy that went in to produce this. There was extraction of materials. We don't have that for the entire community. And you can probably understand how that gets very tricky. I would need to understand, or our unit would have to understand everything everyone ever purchased, where they purchased it from, how it got to them, what they did with it when they were done with it, whether it went into the recirculation, whether it was broken down and turned into another form of material, etc. Now, there are important emissions that are being omitted by not capturing those, but as of right now, there isn't a standard methodology, a protocol for how local governments capture those emissions from the community. So our commitment is to continuing to help develop that protocol, so working with peers so we can capture those emissions. But right now, we felt that it was insincere to capture things that we might do upstream and count those against a reduction because they're not in our baseline inventory. We also don't get the full range of the commute. This is the one that you're going to see an update for in the near future because we're working actively to change this. What it means, as you all know, we have a lot of folks who commute in during a traditional day into our kind of more normal, if you will, day pre-COVID-19. And we only pick up their commute when they hit the boundary of the city of Ann Arbor. But we understand that we are an attractor. People come here to work. They come here to study, to recreate. And we want to understand the full range of that commute and its impacts. And so we're working right now on changing that methodology. And you can see the other things that we don't capture. We don't capture agriculture primarily because we don't have it in our region. And the forestry that we do capture is really the trees that we're planting. So just a reminder, the mission of A20, on the previous presentation, we went into more depth kind of around the purpose, the values around A20, but the mission is the city's mission, verbatim. The vision is that together we're creating and implementing a just transition to carbon neutrality by the year 2030. And you can see an image. We had been working with a graphic artist to do some renderings as the plan was evolving so people could start seeing what it was we're talking about. We still have hopes of engaging that graphic artist to continue doing more visualizations because many of the things in the plan are hard to conceptualize, especially if you're like me, a visual learner. So I only have 2 slides to talk about the process, just to reiterate it. There's lots of ways to cut this. There's a lot on here. As a reminder, the process really followed kind of a funnel approach. There were 3 phases. The first phase being the opening of that funnel, which was called the ideation phase. And that's where we took input from the public, from technical advisors, from reports, from drawdown, from the scientific literature, from our peer cities, interviews that we did. And it all went into the mix as consideration for what could be in our carbon neutrality strategy. Second phase gets to the middle of that funnel, and that's where we started prioritization. And so here we had a matrix, and we had a series of criterion, everything from, there were multiple criterion around equity and making sure, or identifying which strategies prioritize the needs of frontline populations, our minority populations, our low-income populations. We also talked about identifying the co-benefits of strategies, which things were technically possible. Some ideas sounded great, but the technology wasn't readily available yet. And so we just wanted to understand a range of different feasibility criterion. So we ran through a prioritization process. And then we also ran through, that was sort of using criterion. And then we ran through an expert elicitation process. And what that looked like was a different form of prioritization. It's where we asked experts in their individual fields not to rank things based on all of those criteria, but to say if you could only pick 10 actions focused on, let's say, resilience, which 10 have to be in the strategy? And so we used their expertise that they brought to bear to really refine the kinds of actions for prioritization. And then the third phase focused on how we were going to achieve this. I think you've heard me say this, and I think I've said this in the previous video. We thought the third phase would focus on what went into the plan, and that was the way we had laid out the process the entire time. But the truth was, when we got to the end of phase 2 and we did the calculations, the answer was everything fell into the plan, and offsets were still on the table. And so we changed the process. We had a staff meeting, and we spent a lot of time really struggling with whether or not to go out and kind of have a public vote on the final actions. And we felt like it was insincere or disingenuous to ask the public to vote if the answer was it took it all. And so instead, we made the decision to pivot and start asking for help about how we would achieve these actions, which we got really great feedback from the public for. So on the left, you can see we had 82 working days to achieve this. We worked more than 82 working days. We worked weekends, of course, on this. Galen probably pulled the most weekends of anyone on the team. We ran 3 public surveys, the last 2 surveys grossing 1,000 or just at 1,000 respondents. We had 68 public events. We had 80 scheduled. We did cancel 12 due to COVID-19. We had 2 large town halls, over 80 technical advisors that are experts in their field, focused on energy, mobility, resource reduction, and adaptation and resilience, helped us craft the strategy. And we had 66 partner organizations that agreed to work with us and are continuing to work with us. The last part of the process is it was iterative, and it still remains iterative. And what I mean by that is it's not that we took the ideas of the technical advisors and just ran with them, nor did we take the ideas from the public and just run with them. We took all of those things, and they constantly were in conversation with each other. So for example, strategies might have come out from our first round of public engagement and our first engagement with technical advisors that we did explicitly put in our first survey. And then it started to condense as we saw what was technically possible and what was socially feasible. And those 2 things had to come to a head. And that happened and continues candidly to happen throughout the process. So this is all very iterative and living. So the strategy, as just a quick refresher, there are 7 overarching strategies and 44 actions that make up the A20 plan. The 7 overarching strategies are powering our electrical grid with 100% clean and renewable energy, and there's 4 actions under that. The second is switching our appliances and vehicles over to electric, so from natural gas, diesel, gasoline, etc. And that the rationale here, of course, is that as we're making the grid clean, we're moving them to 100% renewable energy by making that switch. The third is improving the energy efficiency in pretty much every aspect of our life. So in the home that you're sitting in your place of worship, in our recreational sites, of course, at city facilities. The fourth is reducing the vehicle miles we travel by 50%. This is significant. Transportation for us, we are anomalous to the majority of the country. In most places, transportation emissions are the largest source of emissions. We are pretty blessed to have a robust and fairly dense community where transportation emissions have only slowly been increasing. But of course, as we close the gap on the other areas, as we figure out how to transition our electrical grid, what will remain in our pie are transportation emissions. That will grow to be a larger percentage as we green the grid itself. The fifth is focusing on changing the way we use, basically changing our relationship with materials, the way we use things, how we reuse or don't reuse things, how we dispose of materials. And it's effectively moving us towards something I think we've talked about before in different planning processes, which is a circular economy, where we're minimizing waste. That what we might have traditionally considered as waste is actually put to a really beneficial use somewhere else in the system. This is low-tech, high-tech strategies, and I know you have heard quite a bit about some of the things we've been thinking about here. The sixth is, all of these are very near and dear to my heart, but this one is one that I have been struggling with a lot over the last few weeks, which is enhancing the resilience of our people in our place. That despite all of our efforts, climate change is already here. We're already feeling the impacts of it. And we need to make sure that our people and our community are ready to not just survive, but to thrive in what's coming down the pike. And the value of resilience I'm going to talk a bit about at the end, because I think this is the very, very natural launch point for a lot of our work, given the exact moment in time that we're sitting in with the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I sort of tease that we cheat and throw the other in like most plans do. This really is, if you've seen it, there are 4 strategies here. 3 are foundational strategies, things like our equity work, which cut across everything that we do. And then the last is carbon offsets. And that's to close the gap, because even doing all of the things above with the assumptions that we've built into the plan, we still do have to invest in carbon offsets. So I know you've seen that. What I wanted to show you something you haven't seen. So we are working on the plan layout. You've seen it in a Word document, and it's fine, but it's clunky. And so we've been working on a design, and this is what it's going to eventually look like, with some modest refinements. So it'll take all of the content you've seen and just try to make it a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. Over here in this coming soon box, what we're doing is modeling the emissions reductions for each individual strategy over time. So this is just one strategy. In this case, it's the community choice aggregation, just because it's the first of the 44 that we list. And what you'll be able to see and we'll be able to use is it shows us, again, who's responsible for implementation. So who's the lead that's going to have to track, project manage, et cetera, who the partners are, any assumptions, because of course there are assumptions built in. And so we tried to be as transparent as possible with what we assumed in terms of public uptick or engagement in a given activity. And then we have a box calling out explicitly any equity impacts, either positively or negatively associated with that action that we're monitoring. And then the indicators of success are the goals that we're going to track progress against. This is the timeline of specific actions or milestones that we'll be gauging for each of the activities. Some are much more detailed than others. Some come online very fast, and so it's a short timeline. It looks different depending on the strategy. You can see the cost over 10 years and the reduction potential over 10 years. So again, what we're proposing to model here, which we actually have the graphics, we just got to put them in the design, is the reduction potential year over year. So this is new. This is just a different way to think about the plan. We showed you the plan broken down by those different strategies, which is one conceptual way to think about it. It's how we thought about it. But another way to think about it is our ability to influence it. So as a local government, we can do things directly as an actor, things where we don't really need much support. I mean, we need public support, but we have the authority and the autonomy to do that. There are things we can regulate, and then there are things that we can influence. So what we did is I took all of these 3 buckets, and I took all of the 44 actions and I put them in these buckets. So this is just a different conceptual way to understand when you look at the plan, for example, some things take time. So things where we are an influencer, but we don't have direct control, we modeled those happening later in our timeline because we need to use our influence to try to get, for example, policy change. Things here where we're a direct actor, we can move on our own. So these tend to be quicker strategies because we can start them. So you can just see a list here of the strategies, and I'm happy to talk about any of these offline. These are the ones we identified as a regulator that we have some ability over. I want to note some of them straddle kind of both spaces. So as a regulator, should we have the ability, should the state pass more updated building codes, then we can regulate them, but we can't. We're also an influencer because we can't, as you all know, set more aggressive building codes without the state passing more aggressive building codes. So this kind of straddles in both. And then the last, by far, the largest, is where we're an influencer. So we're going to need to work with other partners to make these things happen. And that's part of the reason we have 66 partner organizations that we're working with, because we know we need to be collaborating with them. And it ranges from big strategies to strategies that have much more educational value. And that's still incredibly important in our work. So you can kind of see the spread. I'm not sure if this is helpful, but this was just another way that we thought might be useful to kind of think about the actions that are being presented in the plan. This is a summary. We tried to present it in another way to show you what it looks like. So this is the summary of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions modeled year over year. So what you'll see in 2020 is where we are now. There's a modest reduction potential, and then it scales up over time. And the big jump, this is the inverse. If you saw the graphic that looks like a pie chart and then you have the steep drop off, basically what's happening in between 26 and 27 is we're modeling that we get community choice aggregation in. This is basically where we're able to go to market and buy renewable energy for all of the constituents that have not opted out of that program. And we project in our modeling, we assume we're buying 100% clean and renewable energy, that's new energy that's being put on the grid, and that energy is displacing fossil fuels. And we also add a slight premium, assuming that we're going to do that aligned with our environmental justice goals, so that we're investing in a community with a community that has been disproportionately burdened historically by the fossil fuel industry or the extractive economy. So that gets us, that's why you see that stark jump. But we model not only that it comes online in that date, but that we start working on it almost immediately, because we know it's going to take time to get something like that through in terms of state legislative change, because it needs to be enabled at the state level. I do want to put in one caveat that our modeling, you probably have seen this in the other slides, we put an asterisk that said, assuming the University of Michigan participates. The University of Michigan, I think you all know, is going through its own carbon neutrality planning process. And I sit on the commission, and so I get to work with them on this. A goal has not yet been established, nor has their plan been released. And so our model is but a model. It is an assumption. And what we took as our charge from council was the question, what is it going to take to achieve carbon neutrality? And that's what we took as our charge and what we modeled and what we worked on tirelessly over the 82 days. Now, the University of Michigan on this side, this is their projection today, because they don't have their carbon neutrality plan ready. So their projection, as you can see, there's a drop off that's going to happen in 2021. And that's because they've signed on to a large renewable energy purchase with DTE. And so they're modeling the offsets associated with that. And they're going to be making some efficiency improvements at their natural gas plant. And so these are their modeled emissions. They haven't figured out how to close the rest of their gap. They haven't made their plan. They haven't committed to their plan yet. So I want to show this in authenticity, and also because we're partnering with the university to say we modeled them engaging with us in our initiatives, but it's very possible that we'll be editing the plan once their plan is finished to integrate their strategies in, and we don't know what they look like, right? They're going through their own planning process. So this is what we have to work from in terms of what the university has committed to at this point in time. I'm happy to answer questions because I'm sure that's confusing, but I am somewhat limited in terms of how much I can answer about the University of Michigan's future because they don't yet have a plan that's fully established. You have seen this. This is the cost per strategy over the 10-year time period. The costs assume that we're talking about physical infrastructure cost, which is very much why number 4 is the largest. It has the highest by far physical infrastructure cost, which I think, I know it's a big number and it's hard to swallow, but it also conceptually makes sense. If you're investing in physical infrastructure for buses, new bus lanes, that infrastructure is capital intensive. So we modeled physical infrastructure cost. We modeled capital cost, social capital costs, so like the physical beings to do this work, the staffing costs. And there were sometimes soft costs that were modeled into the projections as well. This is the cost per year, with 2025 being the peak because it's the year we project bringing bus rapid transit on or doing the major build out of the bus rapid transit system if we move in that direction. And I know, again, you've seen that slide. We modeled the staffing. This question came up a few times. Here, the staffing moves up and down because it depends on what we projected to do in any given year. And so the base staffing model, if you look across this, is basically at 15.75 is sort of the lowest level. And that's as high as I think we would go if we were to go that high, with the rest being through temporary labor, contractors, et cetera, so that we have a stable set of folks in the office, and then the rest kind of ebb and flow as we're working on something, whatever it is that we're working on in the process. And I can tell you exactly what they are. If people have questions, I can break that down. This is just a reminder in terms of the budget request. Very sincerely, we know we're in the second year of a budget. The world looked different for all of us months ago. And so what we tried to do is be really honest about what we would need to free up some time to really lay the foundation to do aggressive things like fundraising. And so these were the asks that we had. We were the last to go in the budget work session process. And now we're even later in that process. So I know this gets complicated and tricky, but I did want to transparently put on the slide what it was we asked for. So the last two slides are new slides I just want to put up. This is a little hard to read and I apologize for that. This is in addition to the plan where we had a kind of coming soon box talking about the co-benefits of the strategies, but these are now in the updated plan that we're getting designed. And there are things that we all know, that climate action, in some ways, it doesn't even matter if you're motivated by climate action. I think we are as a body, and that's why we're talking about this plan. The beauty of this is there are so many co-benefits for the things that we're talking about, that if you're really motivated by equity and justice, that there are so many opportunities to do the activities in this plan because equity and justice is front and center in this work. Or if you're really concerned about local job creation, which I think we all probably are right now, I can tell you that we need to be investing in the workforce to implement these strategies because we don't have enough workers right now locally to do this. So how are we going to partner with our unions, with our community colleges, with our at-risk youth and others to make sure that they are getting the skills and the training they need to come into this place or into this marketplace? Because we have work for them if we're going to implement this plan. So these are 10 co-benefits that are the most dominant co-benefits that we see. And what we have done is included for each action a list of the co-benefits so you can see them. We did not quantify in the same way we did dollars and cents quantifications or GHG reduction, greenhouse gas reduction quantifications, the value of each of these co-benefits, in some ways because it's just not as easy to do that, or because there isn't a standard methodology for how we capture the actual dollar of biodiversity preservation. So we can continue exploring that if that's of interest, but right now it just identifies in the plan, the updated version, the co-benefits associated with each strategy. This is a lot, but I wanted to put this on because I've been thinking a lot about this lately, and I know we have members of the public joining us too, is that when we went through and when we initiated this planning process in November 4th, when you passed the climate emergency declaration, as gifted as we all are, none of us saw the future. We didn't see the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are now in that pandemic, right? And we are living through it, and we are seeing laid bare the vulnerabilities in our system, the disparities in our system, whether that's from a health perspective or access to resource perspective. We see and we hear about them every day. And I've been thinking a lot about the role of resilience in this conversation. And I think I've shared with you before, we think about resilience as the intersection between how we adapt and prepare for the things that are happening, how we mitigate, in particular climate impacts, and how we ground all of our work in equity. And so I've turned to something that I think we've heard about before, which is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to really think about where we are in this moment and how we make sure that the basic needs that we all have, the physiological needs, the safety needs, the belongingness and love needs are being met in this moment and through the work that we're talking about here. And what I was really struck with as I was trying to wrap my head around things that were happening and this work, the carbon neutrality work and our sustainability work broadly, and our work in the Emergency Operations Center and all of the things the staff are doing day in and day out, was the parallel between the basic needs that we have as human beings and the work that we're talking about in our carbon neutrality efforts. We need healthy food, we need warmth, we need water, we need rest, we need clean air. Those are all things that we are trying to perpetuate in this work. I mean, it's the reason I'm going to guess that you voted for this, is because you understand that. We need safety, we need belongingness and love. And that comes in this idea of social cohesion and the sense of community, the beautiful sense of community that we're seeing in some neighborhoods right now as people step up to help each other during the COVID-19 pandemic. But there are gaps that exist within our community. Certain neighborhoods aren't getting that same level of social cohesiveness. And so we've been thinking a lot in our office about how we're jump-starting things like our neighborhood ambassador program or our resilience assessments, so neighbors understand what neighbors need and can start supporting each other now, because those kinds of things lay a foundation for success regardless of what the perturbation is, regardless if it's a public health epidemic that we're dealing with, or if it's a natural disaster, or if it's something else. And so we are prepared and have been preparing for the last few weeks to run pretty hard and fast at the resilience activities because we see them as being incredibly relevant at this moment in time. So I just wanted to put that forward, acknowledging, I don't want to roll out a carbon neutrality plan during a pandemic. This isn't how I thought this would happen, but it is what's happening. And I think there are still parallels. There are many of them. And I'm writing a piece with a whole bunch of people right now about the parallels between this moment and the climate work. And I'm happy to share that in the future when that gets published. So with that, I will end by saying, as we said, resilience is really important. And so we're focusing right now in this moment in our office on the things in red. So how are we doing things that really are at the intersection of how we adapt, how we mitigate, and how we build resilience for everything that's coming down the pipeline. So with that, I will stop. Questions, concerns?
Excellent. Thank you very much. There are questions? Councilmember Lum.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. And thanks again to Jackie, Sarah, and the IT folks for handling the logistics for tonight. The last week's meeting went smoothly, and I think tonight's will, and it already is, it will as well. And Dr. Stoltz, I'd like to thank you and your team for your effort in developing this comprehensive detailed plan. And thank you as well for answering all my questions thoughtfully and promptly. I appreciate having the responses before tonight. But I'm sorry, I do have some follow-ups, and those we don't cover tonight, I will be sending in. I do think, Dr. Stoltz, that you and your team have done exactly what council requested of you to define what it would take to achieve carbon neutrality and to develop a plan. Now it is up to us to decide what the city and the taxpayers can afford to do. It's obviously not an all or nothing proposition, and the cost benefit equations do vary widely among the strategies and the actions. And there are also land use related strategies and actions with minimal emissions benefit, but many of them have potentially dramatic impacts on neighborhoods, and those need to be discussed much more as well, I think. So I do have some concerns and reservations. We'll talk more about them next week when we vote on the plan. But tonight it's obviously more about information gathering. In that regard, a few questions. One of my requests was to get a breakdown of the $1 billion of costs by entity, the city, the county, the university, AATA, RTA, et cetera. Your response clarified that the U of M costs were not included on the $1 billion in the $1 billion, and the response referred to an attachment that wasn't attached. So if you could send that attachment, and if you have the numbers with you tonight, if you could share them, that would be helpful. Obviously, we don't have any control over what the U of M and AATA do, or individuals for that matter, but we do control city spending. So what I'm looking for at a minimum is the city costs, both the operating and the capital by year, if the plan is proposed as implemented. So that sounds like maybe you'll follow up on that.
Yeah, I'm going to, if we have a moment, I might try to pull up the document. I apologize. It is sort of tricky to try to pull it up in real time. But if I have a chance, I made an asterisk and I'm working my way to try to get it for you. Okay. At a minimum, you'll have it as a follow-up.
Great, thank you. And then for tonight's presentation, you added and you touched on it, the caveat slide on the university. That was your slide 22. And in a response today to a resident question that we saw, you indicated, it was this afternoon, that, quote, the U of M is developing their own plan and it's very likely to have notable differences from ours. I appreciate that you shared that their goals not yet established, their plan hasn't been released, they haven't committed to a plan yet. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate a bit more on again, the caveat slide and specifically the notable differences statement that you made this afternoon, and any of the implications on possible city university partnerships. And the reason that I ask is I can see from your response that there's a lot of, and you touched on this too tonight, information sharing going on between the city and the university. But what I really think is necessary is a city-university relationship that goes beyond just information sharing and includes partnerships on on projects and programs and sharing resources and costs. And the new slide and statement suggests to me that those kinds of partnerships aren't in the cards yet, and that the U of M has its own plan.
Yeah, I will take a stab at that. I mean, some of that really is a question for UM to answer, I mean, in detail about what's in their plan. So what I can share is that UM hasn't, when I talk about this publicly, I'm going to pull back. The way I explain the process is we did a moonshot, right? We set a goal and then we said, we're going to figure out how to get there. UM's methodology is the inverse. They are doing incredibly detailed analysis to determine what is possible before they even set a goal and what they're comfortable committing to. And so that has created a little bit of tension, right? In that we've set a goal and we're figuring out how to achieve that goal, and we don't yet know what UM's goal is. And so that has been something we've had to reconcile with throughout this process. And I think that's what the caveat is meant to kind of elucidate. So for example, if you see one of our strategies, we anticipate electrification, pretty large scale electrification happening at the University of Michigan. Well, they also are concerned about electrification and thinking about it, but what year will that come into play is a different question that we need to understand. And with their plan not being done, we modeled what would be needed to achieve carbon neutrality in the community, assuming UM was in. We also modeled assuming UM did not participate. And so part of the analysis that we're putting together right now is updating those figures to show the difference, the gap, so that we can understand what would be left if we figured it out and UM doesn't. I don't know what to say other than that's pretty obvious.
Yeah, when you see it, they contribute 32% of the total greenhouse gas emissions and 2/3 of electricity. So
we are also working, I'm not sure how useful this is. We are working on a special meeting with management at the University of Michigan to do an unveiling and to start in-depth conversations about the kinds of partnerships that we're talking about. Many of our technical advisors are lead faculty at the university who sit both on the Carbon Neutrality Commission and on the city's work. And so they are bringing ideas back and forth. So those kinds of partnerships are very strong. Of course, I sit on their commission, and so that's wonderful because we're seeding ideas back and forth. There is, I mean, I have a dream of a real partnership where we have, perhaps an MOU that we sign every few years that outlines the exact activities that we're working on from a research perspective and how they align with the city's goals and objectives. And it's a win-win for both parties. And it's a win for students because they're getting real world experience and exposure. I would like to see that emerge. I think that, that's a conversation for all of us and probably you guys to be, if that was of interest, driving a little bit more than perhaps us as staff.
So thank you very much. And maybe as you learn more about the plan for these meetings, and because again, you planted to see that it's very likely to have notable differences, if you could share, report out on what specifically, more specifically, as you said, they're doing a detailed analysis, but any of that information that you could share would be appreciated. And one last question right now, if I may, and this has to do with your OSI budget request for fiscal year 21. Again, I appreciate the clarification that the request is 1.85 million and not the 1.3 that was on the March 30th presentation slide. I also appreciate the breakdown that you provided by fund, but what I don't understand though is how you can be adding 3 new FTEs and another $215,000 in new funding beyond that, and the total department budget is about the same as fiscal year 20. So I'm wondering what's going away that was in fiscal year 20.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we had appropriations that carried over from 19 into fiscal 20. So that was a little bit of the bump, why there was an increase in that year. But what we're proposing is to actually pay for the 3 new FTEs through the millage, the county rebate funding. So taking some of the programmatic dollars and putting them towards the staffing, because we think we can fund programmatic dollars, but it's, through potentially private sources, but it is almost impossible to get private dollars to fund people.
Okay, but that's millage money, so I'll follow up on that later because
Okay, but we put the staffing.
The same,
Yes.
yeah.
Oh, the staffing is in the minus the specific people. So the dollar, I can try to show the slide if this is valuable. The slide where we listed, it's slide 26 for those following along. Everything listed is general fund as an impact, except for the cash for the FTEs. The funding for the FTEs is proposed in the county rebate.
Okay, thanks. I'll likely follow up on that. Thanks.
Councilmember Nelson.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation tonight, and thank you also for answering questions, the written questions. I read them earlier today. I didn't submit any myself, but I see that Jane did my work for me. She asked a few questions that I would have asked. I want to follow up on one of the answers that you had for Jane about fundraising, and I was just curious as a specific, what kind of fundraising has happened up to now? Like how much money has been fundraised this past year?
Yeah, so we very candidly haven't had a lot of time to do the kind of fundraising we would. Well, I enjoy fundraising, but the last 4.5 months have been nothing but carbon neutrality, as you can probably imagine. So the proposals that we have successfully submitted, we have not necessarily won them. We have won $10,000 from the National League of Cities to just continue some of our resilience work looking at climate-based migration. We won a grant from the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences and Assessments, LISA, to look at climate-based migration in our region, building off the National League of Cities grant that we had. And that has gone mostly through partner organizations. We did submit a $200,000 grant. It's a joint match between it's a Partners for Places grant. So it had to have a local funder, in that case, Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation, and then a national funder who is anonymous. We don't know who that is. We've received word that Ann Arbor Area Community Foundation is interested in funding. We just have to get the national funder to come through, and that would be $200,000. And then we're working on a Department of Energy grid connected or connected cities grant, which would be total of $7 million, probably split amongst a number of institutions that I just started working on this week.
When you talk about funds that are going to partner organizations, I think maybe I'm unclear. So you're grant writing for money that's not actually going to the city, or?
Fair question. So not always. It depends on what it is we're trying to do. So sometimes we need a researcher to answer questions for us because we can't do that. And so it's fundraising to get questions answered that we may not have the skills that we would traditionally have hired a consultant to do. So we're basically using grant dollars to displace our own budget that we would be spending external. Other times, what we're fundraising for is the money for us to be able to do part of the work. So the Aging in Place Efficiently program has money in there that we would get to hire an equity fellow to help us design the program. It's got some staffing support for us to cover time to be able to do the work, but more, it's the programmatic dollars that we would be allocating to the seniors whose homes we were going into to do the work. So it's the capital dollars that we wouldn't have to pull from our budget, that we'd be able to pull from that proposal. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I had a question. Your previous presentation, you had numbers in, it was slide 13, that at least when I was viewing it, my computer told me it was slide 13. So I don't know how that relates to introductory slides, but that 24,614 people live and work here and 20,495 commute out and 83,494 commute in. So I had a first question, which is maybe an obvious stupid question, but 24,000 and 20,000, is this just counting adults? Because obviously the population of Ann Arbor is more than 44,000 some. Is that why those two numbers don't add up to the total population of Ann Arbor?
I'm gonna have to double check because that is a figure that we got from Ann Arbor Spark and that our transportation unit has shared with us. My initial read of that was that's vehicles.
Okay, well, because I was looking at the numbers, like the population of Ann Arbor is like 121,000, and you add up the people who live and work here and the ones who commute out, and you're up to like 45,000. And so like, then it occurred to me maybe it's children or something that.
No. So,
okay.
Yeah. I'm pretty confident it's vehicles, but I'm gonna make a note and I'm gonna circle back and confirm that.
Well, okay. So my other question though was, of the 83,494. do we have any sense of how many of them actually would want to live in Ann Arbor? And I ask this question because I'm a family that chooses to live in Ann Arbor. And my husband doesn't work in Ann Arbor. He's a commuting out person. And the place where he works, it just doesn't happen to be a place where we would particularly want to live. Ann Arbor is where we would want to live. And I think it's true for other people that it's possible to live in Ann Arbor and not particularly want to work in Ann Arbor. So that's my question. Of the 83,000 who are commuting in, do we have any sense of how many of them want to live in Ann Arbor?
That's a good question. No, that's not anything that we've surveyed right now. So I can't answer that question. It's a good question. I don't know if anyone else has an answer from previous studies others may have done, but it wasn't in the carbon neutrality.
Okay, and then I have another question. On your previous presentation on slide 49, you talked about loan loss reserves, and I was just wondering if you could explain a little bit about that. The way it was worded on your slide was funds to provide credit enhancements for residents with lower credit scores. So I guess I wondered, are you envisioning that the city is going to be loaning money like a bank, or what would that look like?
So the way this would work, we've been talking to Michigan Saves, which is the state's green bank, about this. Basically, a whole bunch of our market doesn't have really great credit, right? So they're not going to get the same interest rate you or I might get if we go to market today. And some people can't even get credit because their scores may not be good enough, or they just don't have credit, right? They don't have credit history, and so you're in this kind of quagmire. And so a loan loss reserve basically tells the bank, so we're not loaning any money. It tells the banks, we have the money on reserve, so they're not as risky as you think, because if there's a default, perhaps we would cover the cost of that. And so this program, actually Michigan Saves runs one. They have less than a 2% default rate, because what they find is that people, when they access capital, especially people who've never had capital, they take it really seriously and they pay it back in that way. So we have found that we have money from the Department of Energy from an ERA grant that we had quite a few years ago. We have about $400,000, and we're proposing taking that grant money and putting it in the initial loan loss reserve.
How much would that be? What was the amount for that?
400,000.
How much?
400,000.
400. Oh, okay.
Yeah, so we're trying to get permission from the Department of Energy to put it in that purpose. It was already in a loan loss reserve. It was for PACE financing for commercial enterprises to be able to access the market, and we were already guaranteeing for commercial enterprises. We're just now proposing that we turn that for our low income populations.
Okay. And then I think I just had one more question, which is, in your budget, you're asking for $25,000 for staffing and outreach materials for resilience hubs. And resilience hubs are memorable to me because this was a budget amendment that we passed in November of 2018, and we gave you $10,000 of seed funding for resilience hubs. So I was just curious. I had to, in November 2018, I had to Google what a resilience hub was. What did you do with the $10,000 for the resilience hubs?
A bunch of community outreach and engagement events. And what actually has happened is this has proven to be one of the most memorable strategies for our public. It's the one that people come to us and ask to start in their neighborhoods. So we have started the process in the southeast portion of doing some initial mapping of what could be included in a resilience hub. We've brought together some neighborhood stakeholders, and then we've been working on some of the kind of design process-based materials. We now have a group of neighbors on the west side who have started meeting with us, and we've started preparing materials and outreach for them around the resilience hub in their neighborhood. And then we're actually proposing to scale up the concept of resilience hubs, maybe thinking about them a little bit differently given the experience with COVID-19. So thinking about how we might be able to not just have big centralized spaces, but we might be able to use kind of more soft infrastructure to foster neighborhood resilience that eventually could lead to something like the resilience hub model we presented before, where we do have a physical central gathering place, but that we're also leveraging our, I think, really beautiful, sincere desire to help each other right now in this moment to foster resilience and social cohesion long term. That sounds amorphous, I know, but yeah.
So did I hear you say that there are two locations that are looking at resilience hubs, southeast and west side? Where are they?
Oh no. Oh, that
Is that not what you said? I thought you said on the southeast side and the west side.
You're right. I just totally drew a blank on the neighborhood names exactly in that moment. So I'm gonna look on my chat where my team is answering the questions that I am drawing a blank on. Can I get right back to you as soon as I get back to my team? Okay.
I think I'm done. Thank you.
We now have Councilmember Wally.
Thank you, and thanks to staff for putting these meetings together online. It's been very helpful, and staff has been very helpful, obviously, in getting this accomplished. So many thanks to them. I don't have a lot of poignant questions, perhaps. I do appreciate the work that you and your team have put into this. We asked for something, and we got a pretty dramatic plan in response to the call that we put out last year. The price tag is significant, and one that many people jump to first. And I'd like you maybe perhaps, I'm not sure if you can even answer this, but the disconnect between what the folks who filled out the survey were willing to pay a month for carbon neutrality and the actual cost of getting to carbon neutrality. I think the survey said that the average was about $10 a month that folks were willing to pay to achieve carbon neutrality, and yet the plan as proposed is 10 times that amount. How are we as elected officials and other members in our community able to make that connection between the expectations and the realities of what it's going to cost to deliver on that with what we have here? Again, I'm not sure if you can answer that or not, but it just seems like there's a strong disconnect with what the cost is and what our goals are, and what was it a part of any of the outreach, any of the meetings that you had, any of the town hall discussions? I mean, how much focus and information was given on the costs in pursuing our goals?
It is a big question that has many layers, as you know. This is common in human nature, right? Is that we want everything, but we don't want to pay for everything. So I think we should acknowledge that that is generally true. What we did, to your question very pointedly, is as soon as we knew the cost, we started talking about the cost. We didn't hide it. We knew the cost literally hours before our second town hall that we had in February. And we went into that town hall and we said those costs. And we told people and we asked for responses. And from there on out, every public engagement event got people's reactions to that dollar amount. And we did not, our engagement strategy did not focus on going to the choir over and over again just to hear what we wanted to hear. Of course, we talked to people who were climate champions and vanguards, and they're a really important constituency. But we also talked to people in our affordable housing sites, and we talked to people that were caregivers at the Hands-On Museum, and we talked to people at the neutral zone. And so we tried to get lots of different perspectives. At the end of the day, we asked about how people wanted to finance things because we wanted to understand. And what we saw was an appetite to pay that comes in about $7 million a year, right? When you do kind of the math broadly at $10 a person. And we saw a strong desire for us to find other ways to fund it. People wouldn't, when we asked them the question, what would you cut? They said nothing. And so I don't know how to reconcile that. I would welcome your ideas.
Well, I appreciate the honesty in answering that question. I just putting it out there to try to help people and myself in my position to get to where we need to go.
Councilmember O'Malley, may I interject here for a moment?
Sure.
I'm sorry, this is Tom Crawford. I had to join by phone, but one of the things that's interesting in when we start talking about financing this project is as an aspirational plan, we haven't actually gotten far enough to get a detailed financing plan developed. I don't think staff has, but when you look at some of the needs here being like infrastructure, those things often come with federal or state funding and some local matches. And so it strikes me that some of the larger nuggets of the plan as we move forward is an area that we can view as an opportunity where, for example, if there's an infrastructure stimulus plan through this event, maybe some of this will fit into that. And as you go through the 10 years, I think it's looking for those opportunities. But then supplementing that, when I just did a high level math on it, you back up the infrastructure, there's about 160, I believe it was $160 million or so of non-infrastructure funding. And I was just looking at the numbers here. If you had 80,000 residents paying $10 a month, that would get you about $10 million a year. That goes a long way toward, without even bonding against it, toward the non-infrastructure side. So I'm not suggesting that we have an answer to this at this time. That would definitely be overstating it. But I think what staff has done is developed a broader plan that allows us to start looking for opportunities and by bits and pieces, seeing if we can fill in some gaps.
I appreciate, go ahead if you need to finish. Well, that leads me to kind of my second question or point is, whether this can be done in a way where it's all or nothing or bits and pieces, as our city administrator has just talked about, taking some of the things that are digestible and payable, or does it all have to be done at once? And from what I understood is that this is not we can't cherry pick this plan. We need to take it in one pill.
No, so what we were trying to say is that it's not as simple as looking at the math and saying, oh, this is only 2% of emissions reduction, so we're just going to extract that and put this in. That it probably is bigger than that because we tried to avoid double counting. So we can absolutely pull things out and put other things in. It's just you have to give us a chance to step back and see how that ricochets through the rest of the plan, because we were really, really careful not to assume, for example, in the commercial sector, if we have 5 strategies that touch the commercial sector, we didn't want to double count. We wanted to be honest about what it was going to take to get the commercial sector to this goal. So if we pull something else out, if we pull one of those 4 strategies in the commercial sector, this is hypothetical, out, we'd have to go back and revisit the other 3 to make sure we understand the full implications and then figure out what could come in and fill the gap. That's what we were trying to say.
Okay. All right. And I was at a workshop not too long ago. They talked about some of the, needs that these appliances have if we were to switch from gas to electrical for cooking and things like that. And then the fact is that we don't even have the electrical panels in our homes and our businesses to make that type of switch. Have you whether we even have the infrastructure in our businesses and our buildings and our homes to make a switch? I mean, many of these homes only have 100 or 200 amp panel, and you're talking about electrifying something that their needs are far greater than 200 amps, or a business that only has a 400 amp panel, but now you have 2,000 or 3,000 amps that are required. Again, I'm sorry to throw this at you, but it's a concern that I have that, we frankly don't even have the infrastructure to meet these if we had to make the switch tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Everything varies depending on when the house was built, what its electrical load looks like, when it was updated. Same in our commercial, enterprises. Some folks have done electrical upgrades, some haven't. So to the extent we can, the way that we've been thinking about the plan is not just It's not just you replace A for B, right? It is a package deal where the electrical upgrades are factored into the calculations of what it's going to take to be able to handle this additional load. And we've been thinking, as you saw, about things like battery storage, so that's a resilience strategy, but it's also reducing demand on the formal electrical grid. And so you are 100% right. This isn't, I'm not sure how to say this, what your journey might be as a homeowner is different than what my journey might be as a homeowner, because our infrastructure is different in that place. And so that's part of the reason there's a staffing cost that's associated with this, is because it's not a one size fits all in how we do this. It's going to actually take time and effort to support the marketplace and the individuals who's making the transition. So you're right.
Thanks for answering the question.
Councilmember Eaton, Smith, Hayner, and Griswold. Councilmember Eaton.
Thank you. I just have a couple of comments and then a couple of questions. I want to thank you for all the work that you've put into the planning that you've given us. And I really appreciate the urgency that you've accepted with our climate emergency resolution. If I could ask, can you start numbering the pages of your PowerPoint presentations?
Absolutely. It was an oversight. I thought about it this afternoon. I'm sorry.
We have a number of them from you that don't have any page numbers, and also use less color in the graphs so that we don't burn through toner so quickly. So I note that this has a $1 billion price tag, but more than 70% of that is actually improved regional and local transit and the purchase of electric buses. How deeply have you discussed those plans with our transit agencies?
Well, they're part of the formal planning process. They were technical advisors in the process. We've had follow-up conversations about it. I have a sense you have a follow-up question though.
I do. Because it's my understanding that there isn't currently an electric bus that's capable of running on the batteries that they have for an entire service day. And so if you replace every bus with electric buses, you would have to have more buses than you currently have, because you're going to have to switch them out during the course of the day when the batteries run down. So have we considered that? Have we discussed that with AATA and U of M Transportation Department?
Yes, absolutely. So part of the infrastructure cost, it's broken down in twofold. One, I should say very candidly, we do not see eye to eye on the technology. We are hearing from other transit agencies that are having more success than our transit agency projects that the buses will have. Nonetheless, we actually model not just replacing the buses, but adding buses to the fleet to compensate for that if we need to. So that is part of the cost.
Because a full charge on a bus is a lengthy process. You can't just take a bus out of service for a couple of hours. It takes overnight.
Sure.
Okay. And so I appreciate that you're looking more deeply into that, but that's my understanding across the industry. There are some fuel cell buses that have greater success than the electric buses, but that's just my understanding. Another thing is that I noticed on, I think it's page 89 of the previous PowerPoint package that you gave us. I think it was on the 30th. There's a graph which shows that we make almost no progress until 2026, and then suddenly we make a lot of progress, and that seems to be based on the community aggregation of power supply. How deeply have you discussed the viability of a state legislation to allow us to do community aggregation?
Is there anyone in particular with whom we've talked about the viability with, just to clarify?
We have a lobbyist who seems pretty astute about what's possible in Lansing. I understand that we're all optimistic that our legislature could change parties, but in realistic terms, have we discussed the likelihood of accomplishing this legislative goal?
So we've talked about it with our state legislators, of course, and they are very excited about the prospect. But more, I think importantly, perhaps, is that we've started working on this with municipalities throughout the state who we think might actually have more success in introducing the legislation than if it comes from us. And so they are perhaps not as high capacity in terms of being able to write it and draft it, but want to partner with us to move it forward. So that's the strategy we've taken so far to date.
We really don't expect much success in the next 3 or 4 years.
This is one where I think we were trying to be a little bit more, really grounded in realism about just kind of seeing what would happen. I do want to note, though, that if you look at the strategies, what we're projecting is that we are getting some efficiency gains, but we're really focused on electrification. In the next few years, while we're setting up that policy, the reason the emissions look the way they do is we're basically fuel switching, right? So we're getting the system ready to be able to handle that massive transition to 100% renewable energy. We could take a different approach. I'm sure our utility would be very happy if we had residents, like we pushed their My Green Power program and got residents to sign up at scale, and we would see kind of that come through the system. There are other ways we could do that. But again, this was the beauty for us of something like a CCA is because it's a state level policy. Once it's passed, anyone in the state can do it. And so we get to replicate it. We get to pave the way for others to follow.
So then looking at that summary graph, which shows the dramatic decrease in carbon output beginning in 2026,
Yeah.
that's predicated both on the community aggregation and on our mass transit plans. Is that pretty accurate?
2025 is when we see investment, what we projected investment in transit. Right. So 26, we're starting to see that come to fruition.
In like 70% of the $1 billion estimated cost is actually going to be transit projects.
Strategy 4, that's right, the VMT reduction.
Okay, and that's really not city dollars, right?
I mean, the way we projected, there might be some city dollars that go in, but it's really not. I mean, and this is to Councilmember Lum's question. One of my wonderful team members just sent me the matrix. I'm not going to try to talk from it off the cuff, but you'll see that when you see the matrix.
Because over 70% of the cost, the $1 billion cost, is actually transit projects.
Mm-hmm.
And that's likely to be FTE and FRA money.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we would be applying. I imagine the city would be a partner in those applications for sure.
Really?
Do you not imagine that we would be partnering with the RIDE and others in applying for federal funding?
We typically don't partner on the transit authority's capital expense applications, as nearly as I know, but okay.
That might be an oversight on my part. I just imagine if it's part of our carbon neutrality strategy, we would want to be at the table in those discussions, but that might be an oversight on my part.
In the fiscal year 2020 budget, we added an FTE for, I think, an energy manager.
We added the FTE for the community engagement joint position with community services. The energy manager was a position we had already had, but it was vacant.
Okay. Has that position been filled?
We had a failed search, and now we're on hold. We are down to 2 finalists, but with the COVID-19, we haven't been able to bring them in for the final round.
And that's all the questions I have. Again, thank you for everything you've done for us.
Thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. Hey, Dr. Stoltz, you and your team have really done a great job in a very short amount of time. And I think if we ever want an example of how our staff consistently punches well above our weight, this is a great example of that. I think I just wanted to make a couple of points. You can chime in on these if you want, Missy. One is that, the reality of this cost is it isn't about what we want to pay to get there, because we obviously don't want to pay anything, but this is what it's going to cost to get us to carbon neutrality. And I think even as conditions change, we have to keep that in mind and understand that this is where we are, that we're not going to get to carbon neutrality simply by doing what we've been doing all these years. I think we also have to keep in mind that the school district just passed $1 billion bond for improvements on their properties that definitely will have an impact on all of our different, of the 6 different sectors that you talked about. And then finally, and I don't think that I can overstate this enough, is that, you know, the cost of borrowing money in the next year is going to be as low as it's probably going to be in our lifetime. I think that that's an important thing to consider as we break down these costs into kind of manageable chunks of time to think about. So if we're thinking about, you know, looking at trying to raise $250 million for about the next 5 years, you know, the borrowing cost on that is going to be amazingly small compared to what it would have been 6 months ago. So I think we have to keep these things in mind as we talk about the $1 billion cost and all of this. It's how do you break it up into manageable chunks, and what is the efficient way in doing it? And, you know, to a lot of points that have been made, you know, technologies are going to change on things too. And so I think the one thing that Missy, I know you talk about a lot in your presentation, is that this is an iterative and living document. Is I don't think anybody can think that we're going to pass this and it's not going to change, you know, maybe even a month later. It's just the nature of what this stuff is, and the nature of the science. So I am glad to see such quality work has gone into this. I'm glad to see such thoughtful science has come up with recommendations, and I'm excited to move forward with this. Great job.
Councilmember Hayner.
Thank you. This is questions, right? Can you guys hear me okay? I have a terrible connection. Okay, thank you. Thanks for the thumbs up. All right, well, thanks, Dr. Stoltz, for taking this Q&A session here. So I've tried to look at this in a way that is understandable for me. And when I look at, as an example, on the summary of the 7 strategies, I guess I'll start my questions there. So if community choice aggregation being the first strategy with the highest payoff, potential payoff, and then electrification next, well, actually, and then offsets third, and so on. I like to see things lined up and compared like this, especially as it shows the cost per ton to do this. And I see that offsets have a very low cost per ton, but we're still in for 10 million of that. So to get back to the start, so with community choice aggregation being solely dependent on changes in state legislation, for any of these that are dependent on changes in state legislation like this, is there a plan B, or do we just kind of prepare and then ride that one out? I have a series of questions, but I don't know if you want me to ask them all now, or we want to go back and forth. Is there a plan B for replacing CCA if it doesn't pan out?
Yeah, so we are looking at, for some of the strategies, there are plan Bs, there are plan Cs. CCA was the one that we put forward because it is the one that gets us there. I mean, honestly, most CCAs around the country are at cost parity with current electrical systems. So we don't actually see a lot of pushback if we can get it through and it's scalable. But yeah, we're thinking through options B, sometimes C or Ds, depending on what it is. All
right, so when we look at, say, electrification, well, we've talked about I'll go to something that I know a little more about. So we talk about adopting the 2021 building codes, and that'll come online in 2022. And that's going to require, or allow us to require a net zero buildings. And, you know, some of us, and myself included, of course, have advocated for that right out of the chute when we declared a climate emergency. I don't think, you know, I like how in your presentation you say what the vision is going to be in 2030. And, you know, I feel that way about the buildings that we're, you know, supposedly approving now, in that I don't think that we should be approving any buildings that are still going to be standing in 2030 that aren't net zero, carbon neutral. And so that's going to take a couple years to get online. Is there any notion or any thing out there in the world of cities who have recognized the science behind this dire circumstances and declared climate emergencies, creating overlay districts that require this type of construction now instead of waiting 3 or 4 or 5 years for it to come online? Is there a way that we could do anything with our current code or create a climate emergency overlay district or so on, that would really ask development to step up now instead of waiting 3 years when I know that construction is likely to take a hit coming out of this. But still, I'm just wondering if that's something we should try and implement sooner of our own accord.
It's a great suggestion. I need to take this back and understand there are definitely communities who have done it, but as you know, their state enabling legislation may look different than ours. So let me just take a look and do a little bit of research to understand what we could possibly have room to do in Michigan.
Yeah, because like when we looked at, I think the estimation was 200 adding some 250 some units a year or whatever, and that was based on was that the Greater Washtenaw area or?
Right. Yep.
Okay, so a lot of that's obviously out of our control, but yeah, I think there's been something like 6,000 some bedrooms added in the last year or so, and so I just wonder if development sees this coming down the pipe and we take the lid off it, like has been suggested with transit-oriented development as an example, that there's going to be a huge surge to get their buildings in before it costs them a little more to build, which shaves out of their profits. And then we're just stuck with a bunch of built buildings that are not able to be electrified, that are not electric, and sorry. And so I'm concerned about that. I'd like to implement that sooner rather than later. So it's when we ask the folks out in the world, like the residents, to do these types of things, to electrify their own homes and to do energy audits and things like that. Is there any consideration of the city's ability to, say, offer some kind of tax credit or something to pay folks back for energetically committing to doing what they can with their private property to help us out?
I'm going to have to turn that one over to our city administrator to be able to answer, because I know he is much more attuned. What I can say that we're looking at for sure is how we do discounts. So I think, Julie's helping us think about a Solarize program and how we scale that and do that in the energy efficiency sector and do that in the battery sector so that we can get discounts for residents to be able to go forward. We are constantly talking to our utilities about new rebates and programs that we might be able to offer to lower the upfront cost. Right now, you can't get support for fuel switching from our utilities, and so we're working pretty aggressively to try to change that. But in terms of the tax piece, Tom, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Sure. Councilmember Hayner, the existing legislation would not provide for anything like that. In fact, what I've seen kind of as a philosophical, we've tried PACE bonds before, which is where we tried to help with energy improvements, and we tried to get it to apply to residential. But when we talked to the state about it and got we were successful in getting some legislation implemented to permit it in Michigan, but it was limited to commercial only. And I think most of the when you talk about tax credits and things like that, that tends to be for the business environment and not for the residential. I'm not saying something couldn't be done, but that might be it would definitely be a legislative change.
Okay, yeah, I'm just looking for ways to incentivize folks outside of education and so on. I guess what I'll do is because the clock's ticking here, I'm gonna pass on the rest, and I'll write the rest of these up, Dr. Stoltz, and obviously we're gonna have some conversations, over the next months and days and months and in years even, and so yeah, I don't know, it's a good plan, but I also have concerns that so much is reliant on so many others, and I think it makes it incumbent on us to, where we do have control over things like with the transit authorities and so on. We have a couple appointments coming up on there, I think in May, and to make sure that we have the people in place to form the right partnerships. And that's with transit authority, with the university, with the energy companies and so on. I think that's one of the things we can do to affect these other, these partners, I guess, for lack of a better description. All right, thank you.
Before we leave, I just want to acknowledge what you just said, Councilmember Hayner, is really important. And part of the reason I think having even a directional plan, as again, it is living, so it is going to change, allows us to go out and start forming those partnerships and working on the things that we need to be influencing. And that's actually part of the strength for us as staff, is it lets us know exactly where we need to start working immediately. So I appreciate and I just applaud that recognition because it's true.
Councilmember
Thank
Griswold.
you.
I'm sorry.
Am I up?
There was some crosstalk that I was stumbling on, and I wondered, Councilmember Hayner or Mr. Crawford, are you both are you both done?
Yes.
Thank you, Councilmember Griswold.
Okay, I want to thank staff for this awesome plan. I am 100% behind the goal. I can tell you that in the early 1970s, I was driving a 2-cylinder Honda that got 40 miles to the gallon. Some of that was due to environmental concerns, but more of it was due to financial concerns. But I've lived it since then. I think we have lost control of the message. And so I would suggest that we spend more effort on communications. That's not a negative because we're moving ahead quickly, but we really need to avoid headlines like the $1 billion plan implying that, and I know, Missy, that's, you know, you're working 110%, and so some of that's on the back of council members to try to explain that as well to the media, because it's not 100 billion that we expect our taxpayers to pay over the next 10 years. I'm looking at this plan from 3 different values or criteria. One is regionalism. We want, and also equity. We want to make sure that anything that we do doesn't harm our neighbors. And something as simple as converting over to EV vehicles, where are those older vehicles going to go? So if we have less pollution in Ann Arbor, but we're increasing the pollution in Detroit or Dearborn, I think we have to be aware of that. And in terms of equity, we need to make sure that the cost is borne by all of us, and that relates to leadership. If there's going to be disruption, if there's going to be pain, we need to, as the community's leaders, be demonstrating that first. You know, who's going to roll out their 8-burner commercial gas stove? I don't even know what the right term is for it from a commercial standpoint. But we're expecting everyone else to get rid of their gas range, but it's somewhat of a status symbol. And so I question whether that is really going to happen. And if it is, again, we have to be the leaders of that. In terms of the, you said fail forward. It's fine to fail forward when we're doing something that's innovative and untested. But if it's just basic services like roadways and lighting, we need to do it right the first time. We don't have the funding to make a mistake in those basic areas. And then one area that I guess is not going to be part of this plan, but is related to it, and I think we need to address, is flooding. I think we need a stronger plan to prevent flooding, and it's a big issue in my neighborhood. So again, thanks to staff.
Councilmember Grand.
Thank you. I just, obviously the 82 days for staff, like that's, I don't think, well, I know we've never seen any effort like that. It's just incredible. And I think that I do want to just not only recognize Dr. Stoltz and her staff, but that I continue to hear from members of the community. I was at a student advisory council meeting and heard from the liaison there from the university how impressed they are with this plan. And I think they are really taking notice of it. And I know they were reporting, again, without a lot of detail, that there is a lot of overlap between the university and the city's plan. So thank you for that. I also just want to throw out to my colleagues, because I know the $1 million bond was mentioned, and I am meeting with city schools representatives on having that meeting on Thursday, and Dr. Stoltz is going to be joining us. So we are already starting to talk about those collaborations. I'm really looking forward to that. To the messaging, I love this reframing of what we can do as a city as actors, because I think we can put a price tag associated with that that's not $1 billion. And I think that can help a lot with communications. And I'm hoping as we go into this budget cycle and then the next one, that we can really attach actions that we can take and the costs associated with them, and start looping them into the budget. Because I think when we start having tangible accomplishments, that's going to help us build momentum in the community. So I'm really excited about moving forward with the idea of resilience hubs. I too continue, because one of them is on the southeast side of Ann Arbor, which I represent, and I know there are a lot of community members that are excited about moving forward and taking lessons learned. And I think there can be a lot of collaboration with experts in the community about how we can move forward on those resilience hubs. And then last, I just want to acknowledge for members of the public who are watching or who have written to us, we got some really incredible messages from the public in support of these actions, including from someone whose husband was in the hospital fighting coronavirus right now, and was still reminding us about how important it is. And the parallels that we have. And that, I just want to publicly acknowledge that, because that was probably one of the hardest emails I've ever had to read as a council member, to see that, but also just a really important reminder of this work, what it means to the community, what a responsibility we have to move forward. So I'm just looking forward getting behind this in the budget. I know Mr. Crawford is not one who's known for being loose with the city funds. So the fact that he, is coming out already and saying that there's a way that we can get a lot of these done, and a lot of this is with matching funds. And if we can find some staff capacity, if you can go out and fundraise in the way that you put together this plan in 82 days, I'm really confident in our ability to get some matching funds to move this forward. So thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Brand. And just very quickly, Councilmember Nelson, I have been chastised by my staff because there are 3 areas that actually want resilience hubs, and I now know, so that was my fault. Bryant was the one that I could remember, but Forest Hills, not to be outdone, also would like one, as would Sister Lakes. So those are the most advanced areas that we have. And I also forgot that tomorrow afternoon, I'm on a call. We look like we're a finalist for a $25,000 grant to do some solar at a nonprofit in the community. And we're talking about possibly doing that as part of one of the resilience hubs or at one of our affordable housing sites. So I apologize, I forgot those 2 details.
Councilmember Hayner.
Thanks for coming back around. I guess I had a summary question, because we are getting ready to prepare for the meeting on the 20th, which is budget, the budget churning. So this is just a hypothetical. So if we were to have to prioritize solutions here, would you, Dr. Stoltz, would you prioritize based on the cost per ton of carbon removed, or the percent of total emissions and time to begin reducing those emissions, or the total cost of the part of the plan? Or what would be your way to prioritize, if we had to pick and choose because of massive drops in revenues here, how would you do that? What do you think is the best method to prioritize action to get the best results when we need them the most? Because I look at that chart you gave with the seven areas, and it's nice to see them across there like that, and you can see how radically different some of them are, like compost versus recycling, the cost per ton of carbon reduced, but obviously those things have, that has other benefits to the community and so on. And so I just wondered, what would be your suggestion for prioritizing action? Is that something that's in here that I haven't seen, or?
No, it's because this is a really hard thing to answer because I think each of us has different values that we would bring to the prioritization process. And I'm going to just answer from me as an individual. This is hard. So I want to stop and I'm happy to reflect more, but I would say the things I think the most about are equity, and that's a co-benefit. So how are we helping our most vulnerable citizens be able to access these types of programs and services? And then scalability and replicability. So how are we doing things that others can be able to do so we can get to massive atmospheric reductions, or at least statewide reductions? Those are really important values that I have as I think about this work. And obviously dollars and cents matter a lot in this conversation, but you'll find that the things that are scalable and that start with equity first often do kind of price pretty well as well.
So is there a PR element written into all this? So in other words, we understand that, our 120,000 people here in one place in the world aren't going to stop the global CO2 emissions. And yet we do these things as examples, like we do other things as examples for other communities. And so is the PR element written into all of this?
I'm not sure that I fully understand the question. Do you mean like, have we quantified the value of that in terms of?
Well, have we quantified the value, and have we quantified the cost of what it costs to make sure that this expense that we're shouldering is an example that others can follow and others are following? Like for instance, it was in the consent agenda last week, and we bought another round of electric vehicles.
Right.
And I would have loved to seen that on the front page of whatever papers left, right? And so is there a PR element that's built into this that amplifies or multiplies the effort that we're taking here that other communities can follow and also can be motivated by seeing what we're doing?
I think your point is really well taken, and it's not explicit in here, but it should be. And this, in some ways, to me, gets to Councilmember Griswold's kind of question about the communication and the narrative, in that we didn't write a press release that said the city's $1 billion plan. We didn't write a press release, but that's the tag, right, that media picks up. And I think that I'm probably reading into it, so I apologize, correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing you say is that there is an opportunity for us to actually control the narrative more by being out externally facing and telling people, like, look what we are doing and how that ties back to the carbon neutrality work. So we're getting the recognition for the leadership that we are playing with things like the electric vehicle purchase or the landfill solar project. And is that fair to say so far? Am I on the right track?
Yeah, I just think like if part of the point of doing this is to make us part of this global community of, we dropped out of the Paris Accords, the federal government did, and so the cities have had to take over, right? And
Right.
So how do all the cities feel supported by other communities and other municipalities, knowing that we're doing it, Pittsburgh's doing it, this community, that community? I just wanted to see if that was part of our costs here. And I guess the other aspect of that is, setting that aside for a second, my other quick question is, are there things that are in here that are replacing other things that we would normally be doing? Like, I'm really interested, like Councilwoman Griswold talked about, with the resilience aspects of this. And I know our drain commissioner thinks that he would, if he could, require, instead of 150% first flush retention, it'd be 300 or 400%, especially on these new subs. And so are there things that your office is going to start doing now that would have had been done in other places in our staff? Not doubling the effort, but replacing an effort, or
I think supplementing would be.
Supplementing?
I would think about that. Yeah, like we're in the emergency center and operations center, and one of the things that we constantly think about and bring to bear is this idea of resilience, and how we're thinking about people in place and enhancing the work that we're doing, not just for COVID-19, but for everything that's coming down the pipeline: economic disruption, natural disaster, et cetera. So I think that is this idea of institutionalizing more of the thinking and supplementing the thinking with that expertise, if that's helpful. And then to your first point, the costs of PR they're not built into the plan because we sort of already have the ability to do that. But your point is, one of your points, or that I took away from that, would be the role of other cities, and people are paying attention. I mean, I would say from my perspective, I've gotten a lot of emails, as have you, I know, from constituents and people in other areas, but I've gotten a lot of emails from peer cities who are asking, what can we take? Can we steal? Thank you for stealing from us, ideas and strategies. There was a community that just wrote today, and they've been doing a project with Paul Hawken, who is the author of Project Drawdown. And Paul Hawken has apparently seen our plan, and we might have an opportunity to do some work with him, because it's now on the streets. So there's something about being a leader and a vanguard that opens opportunities that wouldn't have happened without being.
Mayor, may I add on to that just a second?
Please.
This is Tom Crawford speaking again. One of the there is a cost to us being out front, and we are leaders and out front in this. But that cost, when you talk about the, as you call it, the PR, if we can get the legislation done through applying our connections and our resources, whether that's through an FTE or something like that, then we have really cleared the way for other communities with a lower hurdle, for example, like community solar, to engage. And that is one of the real benefits to, as you described, kind of the greater movement to make to go toward carbon neutrality. The other, I'll just make one other point from a comment the two of you were talking about a moment ago on staffing. An element of what Dr. Stoltz is doing does require some FTEs, but as she and I have talked about this, we have a need to not just be an OSI department, but a need for this work to be institutionalized. So when she talks about complementing other departments, part of that mission is for us to culturally and philosophically have sustainable and resilient concepts built into the way we do business. And that's part of what she is attempting to do as we try to add incremental resources, or she asked for incremental resources. She's kind of looking at, do I need to do this? Can I share this with someone else? That kind of thing.
Councilmember Lum.
Thanks again, Mr. Mayor, and thanks again, Dr. Stoltz. Just a quick comment and then one follow-up question, maybe two. Comment, and this gets to this $1 billion, matter. I will just say it's one thing to say the cost is $1 billion, but we need to say, and this is why I asked about this breakdown by entity, we need to say how much of that is borne by the city government, by residents, by businesses, by AATA, by the U of M, et cetera, for the cost numbers to have any real meaning. So again, that's why I asked for that breakdown, and I appreciate that you're going to provide that. Thank you. And then also to Councilmember Hayner's, question about how to prioritize. If you look at your, and again, thanks for all this great information and work. On your slide 21, you showed the greenhouse gas reductions by strategy. And then on slide 23, you showed the costs. And my takeaway is there's obviously a wide disparity in cost benefit of strategies. And so obviously we need to prioritize, I would just say, on that front. So the question, in another response that you provided, and I think you mentioned this again tonight, that the funding plan for all of this is still under development and includes a number of potential sources, including a property tax millage. You mentioned there's still ways to go before knowing what the millage ask would be, and that's fair, certainly, but you also indicated that the plan would be to partner or coordinate with AATA on their millage requests. So I'm wondering if you could please elaborate a bit on what partnering or coordinating with AATA means. And then if you could as well share tonight or later what we may know about the AATA millage, the timing or size, the Regional Transit Authority millage, timing or size, and then when the city would plan to place a local millage on the Ann Arbor ballot.
Yeah, great questions. Tom, I'm just queuing you up because I think you probably have more insight if than me on when millages and the amount for the different entities might come forward. In terms of the coordination, though, we have had a few in-depth conversations with AATA, the RIDE, to understand, holistically what the ask is, because a lot of the ask is for physical infrastructure around transit and transportation within the city or regionally. That conversation has laid bare that right now they don't have the funding to be able to make these improvements. And so really one thing I think that's valuable from a frame perspective is that when we did the financing, we talked about what money would be needed. And to your point, I think you're really pushing us in the right direction to outline who would have to come up with all those different resources. But we focused on what's the additional incremental cost that would be needed. And so the RIDE plays a pretty significant role in that. We have started the conversations. We're getting all the math together to really understand. We're working more on the technical, how many buses can they bring in? Where can they go? How can we fund the solar? If we're going to power those buses with solar, what kind of battery storage? How long are those buses? To Councilmember Eaton's point, how many buses might we have to bring in? So we're in that phase of the analysis, and we did the modeling as part of the plan. Now we're doing the refinement. So I don't have specificity on the millage. I'm going to kick it over.
Before you do that, sorry, but in related to AATA, so I was surprised by the response that indicated that AATA has no plans for electric buses until 2035. So if that's right, what would AATA's millage request be for?
Tom, do you want to take this one?
Well, I think the idea of going to the taxpayers and asking for a millage request from a city perspective, not necessarily from an AATA perspective, is really too early on for that. Staff is not looking to become first to taxpayers. We're a millage. We're looking first to figure out how to leverage the partnerships and find other monies. So I think I don't have an answer for your timing, because I think the nature of what we want to attack first and what's feasible first, as you I think astutely identified, we've got to prioritize these things. The idea of the AAATA, I have not talked to them. I don't know what their plans are for a millage, and that's something I could follow up on.
Thanks. Okay, thanks.
Any further questions? Well, for my part, I would, we've had communications online and offline, and I'd just like to, echo what has been said here today to Dr. Stoltz and the rest of her team at OSI, and honestly, other people throughout the organization. Honestly, and why stop at the organization? We have an incredible staff effort. We have an incredible community effort, and that has resulted in the plan we have to discuss today and to consider at our next meeting. This is obviously something of incredible importance. It's a bold, ambitious plan that is that lets us know what we need to do in order to achieve what is an incredibly important community goal, and that is to achieve carbon neutrality. And Dr. Stoltz, you're sitting here today, and so you're bearing the thanks. But I know that and we all do, that although you deserve a large portion of it, that there are so many others around who deserve it as well. And so thanks to you and them. The work is outstanding. It does staff, the community, and the city real proud. Thanks. All right, we now come to public comment general time. Public comment general time is an opportunity for members of the public to speak to council and the community about matters of municipal interest. To speak at public comment general time, one need not have signed up in advance. You will, on your screen now, see a phone number and a meeting ID to call in. Callers will be called upon one by the city clerk using the last 3 digits of your telephone number. You'll hear an automated announcement that the host is allowing you to speak. Callers who would like to speak, let's see, when speaking, we ask that you move to a quiet area and mute any television or background sounds so that we can hear you directly. The clerk is going to keep time. Speakers have 3 minutes in which to speak, and she'll announce it when 30 seconds are up. When you have 30 seconds remaining. When your time is up, you'll be placed on mute, so that we may move on to their next speaker. If there are folks who are new to public comment at City Council, public comment is generally an opportunity for people to provide comments to council. Council listens, but does not respond in the meeting. Is there anyone who'd like to speak at public comment?
Mayor, there's no one waiting for public comment.
Hearing no one, public comment is closed. Thank you very much, everyone. Staff, public, council members, we're adjourned.